morning, everybody. First of all, am I audible? Yes. Yeah, good. Second point, I'm very grateful to Tim Wilson, who is a genuine professor, for pointing out, which I hadn't noticed, a little slip-up in the potted biographies, which shows me to be, well, a sham professor, because I'm not a professor at all, and I want you all to know that. Well, you ought to be. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now, the other thing I want to say before I start is Brian and Anna. Where's Anna? Where's Anna? She's at the back. Thank you both very, very much for last night, which was absolutely spectacular. And, you know, I think despite whatever gems one may hear from this podium over these 2 days, you, Brian, may not be aware of it, but everybody else is, that really the real highlight of the whole event is your speech. So, we very much enjoy that. Now, let us make a start. William Beckford is a man that we all know something about, even if only a little bit. We know about his wealth. We know about Fonthill Abbey. And we know about his Gothic novel, Vathek, even if we haven't read it. But there are many other aspects to Beckford, and the one that I want to explore this morning is one that is perhaps not so well known outside specialist circles, namely his extraordinary legacy as a patron of Goldsmiths' work. And I'm going to show you some amazingly luxurious and inventive things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the processes by which they were commissioned. But I want to explore more than that. I want to look at what they tell us not only about craftsmanship and design and taste, I want to ask what they reveal of his personality. Now, I've only got half an hour, and I'm going to have to cut my cloth fairly finely and be very focused. So I'm going to gloss over quite a lot. I'm going to gloss over his privileged, if rather isolated, childhood. I'm going to gloss over his inheritance of Fonthill's splendens when he was just 10 years old, of its subsequent demolition, and of his creation of Fonthill Abbey. And I'm also going to pass on his role as a collector of old works of art, fascinating though that is. And I'm going to focus strictly on what he caused to be made, even though in one case that was accidental. I speak in riddles, of course, but that will become clearer later. The young Beckford didn't only inherit a splendid house, he must have inherited a good deal of silver, but almost none of it survives, presumably because he had it all melted down to provide the bullion for the first plate made to his own commission, which was probably made for his coming-of-age celebrations in 1781. No ordinary 21st birthday party, this one. It was one of the most extravagant in an age of extravagance and lasted not one evening but several days. And quite a lot of this silver still survives. It was mainly supplied by the leading London goldsmiths, Daniel Smith and Robert Sharp, and it's fashionable and, at that date, perfectly conventional. It's in the Adam style, and it doesn't look as if Beckford was trying to use the commission to send any message at all about himself, other than that he'd arrived and that he was very rich. But one thing does stand out. All of this silver is of quite exceptional quality. And although his taste changed considerably in later decades, there's no doubt at all in this respect that his connoisseurship was fully developed already. For throughout his life, this most consistent characteristic of all the works of art he commissioned was their remarkable craftsmanship and quality. I mean, just look, there's a pixelated photo, but just look at the sharpness of the leaves on that candlestick. You could and can still cut your finger on the sharpness of that chiseling. A quality of the neoclassical style that must have particularly appealed to Beckford was, I think, its combination of elegance and opulence. For although the Adam style sometimes seems light in comparison with the massiveness of its Regency successor, the detailing and high finish of the very best of it ensured that it was far from cheap. Not that painstaking finish was the only way of demonstrating wealth, and he must have hugely enjoyed the muted private indulgence of this teapot. It's a perfectly ordinary teapot, much less highly worked than the candlesticks, and with just a simple beaded edge by way of ornament. Thousands of these were being made for the aspiring middle classes up and down the country, except that this one is made of 22-carat gold. Now, none of these things, obviously, were off the shelf, but Beckford was certainly not above buying contemporary silver that was in stock if he visited the shop of somebody and he liked what he saw. Whenever he went to Paris, he called in on Henri Auguste, acquiring several pieces in silver gilt and gold. He had little fondness for Auguste himself and referred to him in correspondence as the slippery eel. But he clearly admired his work, and when they were sold in the 1820s Fonthill sale, Beckford made sure that this urine basin, now in the Gilbert collection, received one of the most overblown descriptions in the entire catalogue, being described as, and I quote, finished with unrivaled excellence, executed with a truth and feeling unexampled and worthy of the best period of Grecian art. Hello? Yes, that's what it says. But in terms of what Beckford caused to be made, as the turn of the century approached, we see an interesting departure from all this. This amazing basket is one of a pair that he commissioned from Paul's store in 1797. They're large and they're heavy. One of these is actually in the Gilbert collection, and you may be familiar with it. But they are exceptionally well made. But, and this is the important bit, they're not at all typical of Storr. At this time, Storr was running a big manufacturing operation, and pretty well everything coming out of his factory was typical. But these are very Beckfordian. They're entirely bespoke, their quality is superb, and their design is highly original. Now, if you think about it, it amounts to a kind of sublimated Gothic. On the face of it, it's a very naturalistic basket made charmingly out of ears of wheat. But look at the way the stalks interact. One is vertical, but the other two to either side bend over, and they produce a sort of highly abstracted pointed arch. Now, I don't think that's accidental, and I think we're looking at Beckford's first step in what was to become his great love affair with the Gothic. I can't begin to prove that, and you either say you can see my point, or you say that is the most absurd thing you've ever heard. Perhaps you'd like to tell me in confidence later. Now, I did say that I was going to pass over Fonthill Abbey, but I can't pass on its significance. Oh, maybe I can. There we go. Because Fonthill Abbey was many things. It was a great essay, perhaps the greatest ever, in the Gothic revival. It represented the power of money, a money derived, incidentally, almost entirely from West Indian slavery. So there's another statue to topple, if that's your way of approaching these things. It symbolized his rejection of the world, for this was essentially a bachelor pad. And it was a setting for his obsessions. It's probably fair to say that the most compelling of all his obsessions was with his lineage. He was, I can conceal the ugly truth no longer, a commoner. He deeply resented this totally, perversely inappropriate state of affairs, and he spent many years and much money in his efforts to be elevated to the peerage. Indeed, his obsession was so great that it was almost comic. As late as 1837, just 8 years before his death, he wrote in a letter that you will acknowledge that a man who, by infinitely rare coincidence, is without exception descended from all the barons, yes, all, who signed the Magna Carta and whose issue still exists, will not be out of place in the House of Lords. Well, What better way to prove that point than visually by his coat of arms, with all its endless quarterings? This particular blazon shows Beckford's own arms in the first quarter at the top left, next to those of Hamilton, derived from his mother. Then it rolls on to display his alleged descent from pretty well every family that ever mattered. You can spot Edward the Confessor's in the 18th quarter. So you can perhaps spot the arms of Edward the Confessor adjacent to the royal arms of Scotland. Now, Donald Trump has a word for this particular sort of claim, and much of it is pretty far-fetched, I imagine, but he almost certainly believed it. And heraldry pervaded the decoration of Fonthill Abbey too. The St. Michael's Gallery, looking rather like Strawberry Hill, but on a much grander scale, has a carpet charged with the Hamilton cinquefoils, and the ceiling of the King Edward Gallery is decorated with crosses from the 14th century arms of Lord Latimer. Heraldry is a repeated thread in works of art that he commissioned too, such as the Jacobean-style cork cupboards in this slide, you can see to either side of the fireplace, and such also as in this pair of spectacular Worcester saucers. The one on the left has a Hamilton cinquefoil in the center, surrounded by Beckford martlets and cinquefoils, and the one on the right has got, again, the Latimer crosses. But its most spectacular use was on silver. Take this silver gilt sideboard dish in the V&A, made in 1814. It's about this size. It's a pretty spectacular thing. And it's very much inspired by Islamic brass dishes, such as this one of about 1500, also in the V&A, with its damascened decoration. But Beckford has done something extraordinarily original with it. It's completely populated with elements taken from his coat of arms: cinquefoils, crosses, stars, mixed in with arabesques and strapwork. The sheer cost of this intricate and enormously time-consuming ornament must have been enormous. The scope for variations on this theme were endless, as two very different examples show. A pair of sconces of 1804 at Brodick Castle by Paul Storr, and a cream jug of 1815 that I'm going to show you in a moment. The sconces are recognizably neoclassical in their basic design and have Hamilton's arms simply quartered with Hamilton, sorry, Beckford's arms quartered with Hamilton on an oval plate between the two branches. You can see there in the detail. But the whole thing is dominated by the wonderfully sculptural crest, one of two used by Beckford. It's the Hamilton crest of a tree with a saw going through it, augmented by the shield hanging from the tree, decorated with the Latimer cross. The gold ladle, little cream ladle, about this size, is, I think, completely dreamy. The handle terminates in a carved and jeweled mogul jade, and the bowl is modeled as a flower, but not any flower. Look again, and you can see that it is, in fact, once again, the Hamilton cinquefoil. This is not really a functional object, I guess. It's an objet de vitrine, something to display in a cabinet or just to handle to give pleasure. The most creative and evocative works are the mounted pieces. They evoke the world of the Renaissance princely Schatzkammer, but they're distinctly Beckfordian too. They're refined and delicate, and they have a unique decorative vocabulary. Let's look at a couple here. This pair of mounted glass scent bottles, little things about this high, or this agate cup with its jeweled and probably reused mogul jade knop, and that's about that high. A distinctive subgroup of the pieces is those in mounted porcelain. Mostly Chinese porcelain. I think all of these are Chinese porcelain, but there were some pieces from other places of manufacture as well. But Beckford was clearly very much involved in their design. And it's here that another figure makes his entrance, namely Beckford's friend, or perhaps his lover, Chevalier Gregorio Franchi. Franchi was Portuguese, and we know that he acted as Beckford's agent, liaising with the Goldsmiths over their complex details. But he probably had a more central role in that, preparing detailed drawings that show exactly what was required. Look at this, for example, jug and the drawing that the jug has been made from. But the detailing of some of these drawings is absolutely astonishing, as you can see from this sheet and from the little agate cup that is quite closely related to them. But what exactly is going on here, I'm not entirely sure. The cream jug in the previous drawing is a design conveying an aesthetic. But these are highly, highly detailed working drawings, and there's something quite different, suggesting a real understanding of the process of fabrication, and with little marginal notes conveying precise instructions to the maker as to what had to be done. So perhaps another draftsman was involved here too. Because these objects must have been completely outside the comfort zone of most silversmiths or jewelers, because the actual work is much more likely to be done by jewelers, in fact, than by silversmiths. But the need for such detailed instructions would have been obvious. Beckford and Franchi have nicknames for the goldsmiths and would write gossipy letters to each other about the work in hand. In 1815, Beckford wrote to Franchi that he, and I quote, should advise Fiumi, that was their name for Philip Rundle, they should advise a Fiumi, or rather Mr. Storr, not to let the candelabra languish too long. The 4 extra are badly needed now that the other 8 are all in a row. John Harris they called the Methodist, and was the butt of a joke in 1819 when Beckford wrote that now I perceive that the Methodist has had in his keeping the Lapis Lazuli in gold. It wouldn't surprise me if he made off and if one heard no more of him until one read in the American newspapers, Brother Harris, newly arrived from the land of perdition, has gladdened our hearts with much spiritual discourse, etc., etc. Well, we know very little about Harris to corroborate or to refute this assessment, but never mind. Beckford's anecdote does make him seem rather Uriah Heepish, but he nonetheless did supply his patron with some extremely grand pieces, such as this large agate and silver gilt mounted bowl at Brodick Castle. It's about this size. It's almost like a soup tureen. But the smartest of all of these works is probably the remarkable silver gilt and lapis lazuli cup and cover of 1826 in the Fitzwilliam Museum. Now, for many years, this piece was lost and was only known from the illustration in the 1882 Hamilton Palace sale catalogue. The old photo shows, certainly, an extremely arresting piece, but it gives no real sense of its richness. And then suddenly, around 1990, it turned up, forgotten and entirely unrecognized in Australia. And here it is in all its glory. The heraldry is still there. The handles are formed as Beckford's other crest, a stork with a fish in its beak, and there is a ring of martlets around the foot. But the main thing is the unbelievably virtuoso quality of the mounts and the sumptuousness of the lapis itself. What Beckford was after with these jewel-like objects was effect, theatre really, and that came not from the single jewel, but from the ensemble. And this was all minutely choreographed. Everything had its appropriate place. In 1817, he wrote to Franchi that everything depends, my dear Gregory, on where things are placed. An object which looks like nothing on earth in the Brown Parlour is transformed when placed in the Lancaster Gallery. To get a sense of what I mean by this, let us shift the scene to Lansdowne Tower in Bath. Beckford sold Fonthill and most of its contents in 1823. Not a moment too soon, by the way, since this is what happened 2 years later. And from there, he moved to Bath, building a new tower, though a more modest and decidedly un-Gothic one. And he filled it with what was left of his treasures. But nothing shows that sense of ensemble better than this interior view. This was the sort of setting that made sense of these objects, and you can see them displayed in that sort of proto-television set in the middle and in the cabinets to either side. Beckford, it has to be said, was not understood in his own day. The critic, William Hazlitt, described the collection as a cathedral turned into a toy shop, an immense museum of all that is most curious and costly and at the same time most worthless in the productions of art and nature. Warming to his theme, Hazlitt goes on, Mr. Beckford has undoubtedly shown himself an industrious bijoutier, a prodigious virtuoso, an accomplished patron of unproductive labor, and an enthusiastic collector of expensive trifles. But the only proof of taste, to our thinking, he has shown in this collection is in his getting rid of it. Many would doubtless share this view today. You only have to walk the aisles of Masterpiece to know that. But not too many, I hope, in this audience. And I hope, too, that you'll be intrigued by the evidence of some of his commissions of a clearly scholarly interest in design history. Commissioned pieces that show knowledge of Renaissance pattern books, some of which were, one imagines, in his library. This wonderfully intense... sorry. That is, I should have put that earlier. That's just to remind you of the sort of sense of ensemble that these objects, as shown at Lansdowne Tower, could create. But not those, but this wonderfully intense spoon of 1812 is based on a print of 1539 by Heinrich Aldegraver. Although Beckford couldn't resist the personal touch of adding in the little Hamilton cinquefoil on the end of his spoon. Doesn't show, of course, in this slide, but it's there, and there is one in the Welby collection, which you can see at the Ashmolean Museum, where I think it's displayed in such a way that you can see that cinquefoil on the end. Then there's another direct quotation in the mount of a rock crystal beaker of 1818, this time from a mid-16th century pattern book by Hans Brosimer. And as a final example, there's a pair of silver gilt candlesticks made in 1800 by Paul Storr, which are directly modelled on late 17th century French bois de bagarre. Now, I said I wasn't going to touch on Beckford as a collector of antique goldsmiths' work, but there is one piece that I must mention, if only because it was, in a sense, closer to a commission than Beckford might have realized. This is what I meant when I referred at the beginning to an accidental commission. The piece at the center stage of this still life from Rutter's delineation of Fonthill Abbey, this shows a group of some of Beckford's, well, both his contemporary pieces, but also some of his great historic treasures. And at the center of it is a mounted hardstone ewer that is now in the Metropolitan Museum. In Rutter's delineations, it's described, let's look at the real thing, it's described as a vase of Hungarian topaz, the largest one of one block ever known, magnificently decorated with enamels and precious stones, the execution of Benvenuto Cellini, and so it continues. But it was the subject of a sensational dispute at the Fonthill Abbey sale, which was fulsomely reported in the Salisbury and Winchester Journal. The report goes as follows. The magnificent topaz cup, which has been so long considered one of the chief objects of curiosity in the Abbey, and on which Benvenuto Cellini lavished all his skill, was put up for sale. A Mr. Lewis, a London silversmith, declared it was not a topaz, but a crystal. And this assertion, so unhesitatingly made, seemed to startle the company, who were assembled to witness the disposal of this celebrated gem. Mr. Phillips, the auctioneer, expressed his astonishment at the boldness of this assertion and declared that he stood by his description of it. Mr. Beckford, whose refined taste and judgment were so well known and so infinitely superior to Mr. Lewis's, never entertained any other opinion but that it was a topaz, and he, Phillips, thought Mr. Lewis presumed too far in declaring it to be crystal, considering the very limited acquaintance he had with the article. Well, in fact, Mr. Lewis, Kensington Lewis, silver retailer to the Duke of York, was absolutely right, and it is rock crystal. But that, what no one seemed to pay much attention to was the mounts, which are not, of course, by Cellini at all, but are, in fact, entirely fake and made only shortly before Beckford acquired it, very possibly with this particular victim in mind. Fonthill Abbey did not draw a line under Beckford's commissioning, but it did signal a change. Or at least a change is clearly recognizable towards the end of his life, when he began to commission silver of entirely a different character. This hot water jug from Brodick and this pair of candlesticks were made shortly before his death, and they are in a new manner altogether. Quite different from everything that came before, a sort of hybrid classical revival. These are no less distinctive and no less original than any of the other things that we've been looking at. But one thing has clearly not changed, and that is the determined adherence to quality that marked everything made for William Beckford, from his coming-of-age celebrations to the end of his life. Well, now, we've all played those what if you could travel back in time and meet anyone you chose, who would it be sort of games. And I have to confess that I'm never quite sure that Beckford would be on my list. His house, yes, but he himself, I'm a little nervous. How, I wonder, would Ros Saville have handled that conversation if he had been summoned up from the grave yesterday? Brian, something to plan maybe for another time. Beckford was a connoisseur. Of that there can be absolutely no doubt, and even his fiercest critics, like William Hazlitt, admitted he had an eye. But he also had a sense of theatre, and with his collecting, both of these qualities came together. Objects had to be beautiful, exquisite even, but they had to play a part too. And for him, Fonthill Abbey and Lansdowne Tower were primarily stages on which all the things were a kind of cross between props and players. It was, one feels, all the glorious fantasy, or it was sham, and yet at the same time, one feels that that characterization just won't quite do. There's a contradiction at the heart of Beckford that I just don't think we can resolve. On the one hand, there was this sense of coldness and misanthropy, a sense that all this magnificence was just a substitute for the real things that his life did not contain. That, to my mind, is always part of the impression that one gets from Rutter's evocative images of grand, unpeopled corridors. But on the other hand, there's something else. It's a kind of feeling that these objects stir, especially when seen en masse and at close quarters, that there is a point where craftsmanship is so perfect and materials so exquisite that they take on a sublimity of their own. And in that sense, it's not cold at all, but quite the opposite. I find it enriching and life-enhancing, and I hope you might agree.